Thomas and Linda seemed like the perfect older couple, steady and respected in their quiet neighborhood. Jake and Emily, much younger and full of restless energy, appeared to be starting their lives together with promise. But when the two couples crossed paths, boundaries blurred, marriages twisted into secrecy, and desire turned into betrayal. What began as an unusual arrangement between four people ended in jealousy, obsession, and a brutal crime that shocked everyone who knew them. Thomas and Linda had been married for over 30 years, and to most people who knew them, they looked like the perfect example of a stable couple. They lived in a quiet neighborhood where everyone waved at each other while mowing lawns or walking dogs. And their large, well-kept home reflected the years of hard work and discipline that had defined their marriage. Yet behind the clean windows and neatly trimmed hedges, their relationship had grown stale. The spark that once defined their younger years was gone. Conversations had become routine, meals felt like obligations, and evenings were filled with television instead of connection. They weren't hostile toward each other, but there was a distance, a silent agreement that this was the life they were now stuck with. Both of them longed for excitement, though neither wanted to admit it. Their children had grown up and moved far away, leaving the house empty. Thomas spent most of his time thinking about retirement while Linda searched for small hobbies to keep herself busy. They loved each other in the way people do after many years together, comfort mixed with resignation. But deep down, they both wanted more. That quiet desire set the stage for everything that would soon unravel. On the other side of town, Jake and Emily were beginning their lives as a young couple. Both in their 20s, they were energetic, impulsive, and still trying to figure out adulthood. They had married quickly, drawn together by passion, but the responsibilities of bills, rent, and long work hours had already started to wear them down. Arguments were frequent, money was always short, and Emily sometimes wondered if she had made a mistake by settling down so young. Jake was charming but restless. He often looked for distractions, and those distractions weren't always harmless. It was at a neighborhood social gathering that the two couples' paths first crossed. A mutual friend introduced them at a backyard barbecue. Thomas and Linda stood out immediately to the younger pair. They seemed established, confident, and comfortable in ways Jake and Emily were not. The older couple carried themselves with the authority of people who had survived decades together, while the younger couple radiated youth, spontaneity, and energy. What began as small talk over food and drinks stretched into hours of laughter. Both couples enjoyed the unlikely connection, and when the evening ended, they agreed to meet again. At first, the meetings were innocent. They shared dinners, went on double dates, and even invited each other into their homes. It felt refreshing to break out of their usual circles. For Thomas and Linda, being around a young couple reminded them of their own early days. For Jake and Emily, the stability of the older couple offered a sense of security they lacked in their chaotic lives. But over time, the dynamic began to shift. There was something unspoken in the air whenever they were together, lingering looks. Playful teasing, a kind of attention that crossed the line between friendship and something else. It was Linda who first noticed it. She felt alive again in Jake's presence. He complimented her in ways Thomas hadn't in years, and the way he looked at her made her feel desirable. She hadn't realized how much she missed that feeling until Jake gave it to her. Thomas, too, found himself watching Emily more closely. She was vibrant and beautiful, and she reminded him of a time when life still felt full of possibility. The temptation grew stronger with each meeting until it was no longer possible to ignore. The suggestion came one night after too many glasses of wine. What if they traded partners just once to see what would happen? Laughter followed, nervous at first, but beneath the laughter was genuine curiosity. They dismissed it in the moment, but the idea lingered. In the days that followed, they thought about it more than they wanted to admit. It wasn't long before fantasy became reality. The first time it happened, it felt reckless, even thrilling. Each of them convinced themselves it was harmless, that no one would ever know, and that it was simply an experiment. They returned to their regular lives as if nothing had changed. But the truth was that everything had changed. The secrecy bound them together in ways they hadn't expected. Linda couldn't stop thinking about Jake, and Thomas found himself distracted by thoughts of Emily. What was supposed to be a one-time thrill turned into something far more dangerous. The arrangement continued in secret, with meetings that grew bolder each time. None of them admitted it, but emotions were beginning to stir. Linda was more invested than anyone else. She hadn't felt this much attention in years, and it was intoxicating. Jake, on the other hand, was drawn to the attention and gifts Linda showered on him, things his own wife couldn't provide. Emily grew increasingly uneasy. What started as a thrill now felt like a threat. She sensed that she was losing Jake to the older woman, and jealousy began to fester. Thomas, too, struggled with conflicting emotions. On one hand, he felt guilty, but on the other, he couldn't let go of the excitement Emily gave him. For the first time in decades, he felt young again. But the more he leaned into the arrangement, the more distant he grew from his wife. Pushing her closer to Jake, the lines between the couples blurred until no one was entirely sure where loyalty ended and betrayal began. As the weeks passed, the initial thrill wore off and was replaced by tension. What once felt exciting now carried weight? They were lying to their families, their friends, and even to themselves, yet none of them could stop. The older couple had discovered a spark they thought was gone forever, and the younger couple had become entangled in something they couldn't control. What began as curiosity had spiraled into obsession, and it was only a matter of time before someone broke under the pressure. The stage was set for disaster, though none of them realized it yet. To the outside world, Thomas and Linda remained the respectable older couple with a perfect home, and Jake and Emily were just another young pair trying to make it through life. But beneath the surface, a dangerous secret was growing, one that would soon consume them all. The decision to cross that line had already been made, and there was no going back. The secret arrangement had begun as something playful, an escape from routine that all four of them believed they could control. They told themselves it was harmless, that it was just about excitement and nothing more. But the more they tried to keep it simple, the more tangled it became. The secrecy had its own weight, heavy and suffocating. Each time they met, they added another layer of lies to their lives. Every look, every touch, and every meeting became harder to explain. The truth was no longer a fleeting shadow. It was a storm gathering on the horizon. Linda found herself waiting for Jake's calls and messages, watching the clock like a teenager again. She loved the way he looked at her as if she was the only person in the room. That attention filled a void she had lived with for years. She convinced herself that what they shared was special, something beyond the reckless arrangement that had begun it. Thomas noticed her glow but mistook it for her being happy. He was too distracted by his own secret to see that Linda's affection had already shifted away from him. Jake enjoyed the thrill of being wanted by someone older, someone who showered him with admiration and gifts. He was used to Emily's frustration and complaints about bills and work, but with Linda, he felt like a man who could do no wrong. At first, it was intoxicating, but soon he began to sense the danger. Linda's attachment was not casual, and she wanted more from him than he had ever planned to give. He started to feel trapped, pulled between his wife and a woman who had become dangerously invested in him. Emily, meanwhile, felt the sting of betrayal even though she had agreed to the arrangement. She had been curious at first, tempted by the idea of adventure. But as she watched Jake's behavior change, she realized the game had shifted. The way he looked at Linda, the way he smiled when his phone buzzed, and the way he stayed out later than usual, all of it painted a picture she didn't want to see. She felt like she was being replaced, not only as Jake's wife but as his source of affection. Jealousy dug into her like a knife, and every day it cut deeper. The meetings continued, but they no longer carried the carefree energy of the beginning. The air was heavier, filled with suspicion and unspoken accusations. Linda and Jake grew closer, often slipping away together while Thomas and Emily pretended not to notice. Thomas began to feel uneasy, watching the way Jake and his wife interacted. He tried to push down the feeling, telling himself it was part of the arrangement, but the doubt lingered. He started to see Jake less as a distraction and more as a rival. Emily's anger boiled over one evening when she confronted Jake in private. She accused him of being too invested in Linda, of giving her more attention than his own wife. He denied it at first, but his hesitation was louder than his words. That silence was all Emily needed to confirm her fears. In that moment, she realized that she wasn't competing with a fling anymore. She was losing her husband to another woman. That realization filled her with a cold kind of rage, the kind that doesn't fade with time, but instead grows sharper. The tension bled into every interaction. Their dinners together turned into silent affairs filled with glares and clenched jaws. Thomas started keeping closer tabs on Linda, following her with his eyes, checking her phone when she wasn't looking and growing more paranoid with each passing day. Linda, however, ignored his suspicions. She was too lost in the fantasy Jake gave her, too desperate to cling to the feeling of being wanted. Jake, caught between Linda's obsession and Emily's fury, began to spiral. He drank more heavily than usual, missed work, and grew careless. His recklessness only deepened Emily's anger. She no longer saw him as her partner, but as someone slipping through her fingers. The thought of Linda taking what little she had left made her restless. She began imagining ways to stop it, ways to make sure Linda could never replace her. At the same time, Thomas's resentment festered. He had once enjoyed the thrill of Emily's attention, but it no longer satisfied him. The knowledge that his wife was slipping away made him bitter. He started blaming Jake for everything: the distance in his marriage, the loss of trust, even the hollow emptiness he felt inside. He told himself that if Jake had never entered their lives, things would have been different. The truth, of course, was far more complicated. The cracks were no longer subtle. Friends who saw the couples together began to notice the tension. They whispered about the odd closeness between them, about the looks that lingered too long, about the strange distance between Thomas and Linda. Rumors spread quietly, though none of the couples admitted anything. The web of lies was becoming harder to maintain, and with each passing day it threatened to collapse. One night, the four decided to take a short weekend trip together, hoping it would ease the tension. They thought a change of scenery might remind them of why they had started this dangerous game in the first place. But the trip only magnified everything that was already wrong. Arguments erupted over the smallest things. Linda and Emily exchanged sharp words when they thought the men weren't listening. Thomas accused Jake of being careless, while Jake grew defensive and cold. Instead of healing the rift, the trip deepened it. By the time they returned home, the arrangement had turned toxic. What was once a secret thrill had become a cage. None of them trusted each other anymore, yet none of them could walk away. They were bound together by lies, betrayal, and desire, each of them convinced they had too much to lose if the truth came out. But Emily had reached her breaking point. In her mind, there was only one way to end the nightmare. She was no longer thinking about compromise or repair. She was thinking about revenge. The stage was set for something irreversible. Linda was lost in obsession, Thomas was consumed with paranoia, Jake was drowning in guilt, and Emily was sharpening her anger into something far more dangerous. None of them could see it clearly, but the path they were on was no longer about stolen moments or dangerous thrills. It was heading toward destruction, and the first cracks of tragedy were already visible. Thomas had always been the calm one, the husband who measured his words and kept his emotions buried beneath layers of discipline. But lately, something inside him had begun to shift. He could no longer ignore the feeling that his wife was slipping away. At first, he told himself it was paranoia, that the arrangement was equal, that they had all agreed to it. But late at night, when he lay awake listening to the sound of Linda's soft breathing beside him, the doubts crept in. He pictured her with Jake, laughing in ways she hadn't laughed with him in years, giving herself to a younger man while he sat at home pretending everything was normal. The thought gnawed at him until it became unbearable. Linda noticed her husband's unease but dismissed it. She was too wrapped up in the attention she craved. Jake made her feel alive, and she clung to that with desperate intensity. Every message from him was a spark, every stolen moment a reminder that she was still desired. She told herself it was harmless, even necessary, because it filled a void Thomas could no longer fill. She didn't see his suspicion growing. Didn't he notice the way his eyes lingered on her phone or the sharp edge in his voice when he asked about her day? Jake, meanwhile, was unraveling. The thrill had long passed, replaced by a heaviness that followed him everywhere. He drank more, avoided Emily's questions, and snapped at her over the smallest things. His guilt over the affair with Linda was mixed with frustration. He had never meant for it to go this far, but he couldn't pull himself away. The gifts she gave him, the way she looked at him like he was the center of her world, it was addictive. Yet deep down, he knew it was dangerous. Emily's anger simmered with every passing day. She watched Jake withdraw from her and pour his energy into someone else. She felt invisible, discarded, as though her youth and beauty weren't enough to hold his attention. The betrayal cut deeper because she had agreed to the arrangement, thinking it would bring excitement into their lives. Instead, it had stolen what little stability they had left. Her trust was gone, and in its place was a cold determination. If Jake wouldn't choose her, she would make the choice for him. The tension reached its breaking point during the weekend getaway they had planned. The four of them drove to a rented cabin near the lake, hoping a change of scenery would restore what had been lost. The trip started with polite smiles and forced laughter, but the cracks showed quickly. Thomas kept a close watch on Linda, noticing the way she lingered near Jake, the way her eyes followed him across the room. Emily's silence was sharp, filled with resentment that grew heavier with every passing hour. The first night, they sat around the fire, drinks in hand, trying to recreate the carefree atmosphere they once had. But the conversations felt strained, and the air was thick with unspoken accusations. When Linda reached over and brushed Jake's arm, Thomas stiffened, his jaw tightening as he stared into the flames. Emily saw it too, and her grip on her glass tightened until it nearly shattered in her hand. The following morning, the tension boiled over. Emily confronted Linda with thinly veiled words, hinting at her frustration and jealousy. Linda responded with icy calm, dismissing her concerns as though they were childish. Jake tried to defuse the situation, but his nervous laughter only made it worse. Thomas, who had been watching quietly, finally exploded, accusing Emily of stirring trouble and Jake of disrespecting him. The argument spiraled until all four of them were shouting, voices echoing through the cabin. When the fight finally ended, nothing had been resolved. They retreated into silence, each of them nursing their own grudges. The weekend, which was supposed to bring them closer, had instead driven them further apart. By the time they returned home, the fragile balance that had held them together was shattered. Thomas couldn't let go of what he had seen. His suspicions solidified into certainty. He began watching Linda more closely, following her when she left the house, checking her messages when she wasn't looking. The paranoia consumed him, turning him into a man he no longer recognized. He felt powerless, and that helplessness festered into anger. Linda, oblivious to the full extent of his suspicions, continued her secret meetings with Jake. She convinced herself she could manage both her marriage and her affair, that Thomas would never truly find out. But every time she slipped away, Thomas grew more certain, more restless. He wasn't just suspicious anymore, he was preparing for the truth he knew was coming. Jake's life spiraled further out of control. He skipped work, lied to his friends, and drowned himself in alcohol. His guilt was a constant weight, but so was his dependence on Linda. He wanted to stop, but every time she called, he answered. He couldn't resist her attention, even though it was destroying everything else around him. Emily, however, had reached a different kind of breaking point. She no longer cried or begged for Jake's attention. Instead, she watched quietly, planning her next move. Her rage had crystallized into resolve. She studied Linda, noting where she went, when she left, and how often she met Jake. The more she observed, the more certain she became of what she needed to do. The lives of the two couples were unraveling in slow motion, each of them blinded by desire, jealousy, or paranoia. The arrangement that had started as a secret thrill had become a trap none of them could escape. The lies piled higher, the trust was gone, and the sense of control had vanished. What remained was resentment, obsession, and the quiet certainty that something terrible was about to happen. The cracks had widened too far to ignore. Friends who once admired Thomas and Linda's stability began to whisper about the tension between them. Neighbors noticed Jake's erratic behavior and Emily's cold silence. Everyone could sense that something was off, though no one knew the truth. But the truth was already pulling them all toward the inevitable. The weekend trip had shown them the reality. This wasn't just a dangerous game anymore. It was a battlefield where loyalties shifted and tempers flared. Each of them felt betrayed in different ways, and each of them wanted something the others couldn't give. Linda wanted to hold on to youth through Jake. Jake wanted freedom, but couldn't break away. Thomas wanted his wife back, but didn't know how to fight for her. Emily wanted revenge, and she was no longer willing to wait. The four of them were standing at the edge of a cliff, and the ground beneath them was crumbling. None of them could see how close they were to falling, but the fall was coming. And when it came, it would not just break their fragile arrangement. It would destroy everything. Emily had reached a place where anger no longer came in bursts. It lived inside her now, steady and consuming, guiding her every thought. She had spent weeks pretending to accept the situation, watching as Jake drifted further into Linda's arms, but beneath the surface she was plotting. She no longer cared about saving her marriage. She no longer cared about the promises they had all made. All she cared about was taking back the control she felt Linda had stolen from her. Each day she studied their patterns, piecing together the secret life that her husband and the older woman shared. She knew when Linda left her house, which nights she made excuses to Thomas, and how long her meetings with Jake lasted. The more Emily uncovered, the more convinced she became that only a permanent solution would end her torment. Thomas noticed his wife's absences too, but his suspicions never fully aligned with Emily's. He imagined betrayal but never envisioned the details. His paranoia grew so strong that he began trailing Linda in his car at night, convinced that he could catch her in the act. Once, he even parked outside a cafe where he thought she might be meeting someone. He waited for hours, but she never appeared. His mind was unraveling, twisting itself into knots of suspicion and dread. But while Thomas lost himself in paranoia, Emily sharpened hers into action. She didn't rush. She understood that timing was everything. She began testing her limits, following Linda from a distance, slipping behind her at stores, noting which paths she walked and which roads she took home. No one noticed her there. Emily was careful, blending in, wearing different clothes, always keeping enough distance. She was patient, and with every new piece of information, her plan grew clearer. The night finally came when Linda left her home with the intention of meeting Jake. She told Thomas she was running errands, a lie he half believed only because he had grown too exhausted to challenge her. Emily was already waiting in the shadows, her car parked a few streets away from Linda's destination. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind so many times that the reality felt like a continuation of her thoughts. Her heart pounded, but her resolve never wavered. When Linda arrived and slipped into the quiet meeting place, Emily followed on foot, staying in the dark. She watched them together, the way Jake leaned toward her, the way Linda touched his arm as though they were a couple. In that instant, Emily felt something snap inside her. It wasn't just betrayal. It was humiliation, a deep wound carved by the sight of her husband giving himself to another woman. The rage that had been simmering for months surged into action. She could no longer just watch. Emily stepped out from the shadows and confronted Linda when she was alone. Jake had gone ahead to start the car, leaving Linda to follow behind. It was the chance Emily had been waiting for. Fueled by months of jealousy and despair, she attacked with a violence no one expected from her. The struggle was fast and brutal. Linda's cries were swallowed by the night as Emily's fury poured out in every strike. When it was over, Linda lay motionless on the ground, her life extinguished by the woman she had unknowingly pushed too far. Emily stood over the body, her breathing ragged but her mind frighteningly calm. She felt no regret, only relief. The weight of betrayal seemed to lift off her shoulders as she stared at what she had done. When Jake returned and saw the scene, his face drained of color. He hadn't imagined Emily would take it this far. He panicked, stumbling over his words, insisting they had to call the police, but Emily silenced him with a cold glare. She told him that if he cared about saving himself, he would help her. Jake was terrified, but fear made him obedient. Together, they dragged Linda's body into the trunk of Emily's car and drove for miles into the night. They searched for a place secluded enough to hide what they had done. The drive was silent except for the sound of Jake's nervous breathing and Emily's steady grip on the wheel. When they finally stopped on a desolate road near a patch of woods, they carried the body out and left it where they hoped no one would ever find it. On the drive back, Jake could hardly keep his hands from shaking. He stared out the window, numb with shock, while Emily kept her eyes on the road. She wasn't shaken like him. She was cold, methodical, already thinking about what to say if questions were asked. To her, the act had been necessary. Linda had stolen what belonged to her, and Emily had simply taken it back. Back at home, Thomas grew restless when Linda didn't return. At first, he assumed she was still out running errands, but as the hours stretched into the early morning, panic crept in. He called her phone repeatedly, but it went unanswered. When dawn arrived and she still hadn't returned, he knew something was wrong. His mind, already poisoned by paranoia, jumped to the worst conclusions. He called the police, reporting his wife missing. The investigation began quickly. Detectives questioned Thomas about his marriage, about where Linda might have gone and who she might have been with. He hesitated, unsure how much of the truth he should reveal, but eventually the strange arrangement between the two couples emerged. It was an odd piece of information that immediately drew suspicion. The police began looking at Jake and Emily, noting the unusual closeness between the four and the tension that others had observed. Emily played her part well at first. She pretended to be shocked by Linda's disappearance, offering sympathy to Thomas and answering the detective's questions with calm certainty. But Jake struggled to keep his composure. The weight of what they had done pressed on him until he grew visibly nervous under questioning. His drinking worsened and his behavior caught the detective's attention. The search for Linda intensified. Surveillance cameras near the meeting place showed Emily's car driving suspiciously close to the area on the night she vanished. Phone records painted a clearer picture of the late-night communications between Linda and Jake. Slowly, the evidence began to circle them. Jake was the first to crack. The interrogations wore him down, stripping away the thin mask of composure he had left. He admitted to helping Emily, though he insisted he had no part in the killing itself. His confession turned the spotlight directly onto Emily. She no longer had room to maneuver. When the detectives confronted her with Jake's testimony, she didn't cry or beg. She simply admitted what she had done, her voice flat, as though she were explaining something inevitable. To her, it was never murder. It was justice in her own mind, the only way to reclaim what she had lost. But to everyone else, it was cold-blooded. The community that once whispered about the strange closeness of the two couples now spoke in shock about the brutal crime. Linda's death became the tragic center of a story that had started with curiosity and ended in horror. And while Emily was led away in handcuffs, Thomas sat alone in his house, staring at the empty chair where his wife once sat. The betrayal, the lies, and the violence had left him hollow. Nothing about their quiet suburban life remained. Everything had been destroyed by the choice to chase a thrill that none of them could control. The disappearance of Linda quickly turned from a missing persons case into something far darker. Detectives knew from the start that her absence wasn't typical. She wasn't the kind of woman to vanish without reason, and those closest to her painted conflicting pictures. Thomas described her as distant in recent months, while Jake admitted they had been in touch more often than most people would expect. Emily stayed calm during her interviews, but the investigators could sense something unsettling beneath her composure. The unusual bond between the two couples immediately stood out, and the detectives began to dig into their private lives with growing suspicion. The investigation intensified as phone records revealed a flood of late-night calls and messages between Linda and Jake. The timeline placed them together far too often for it to be explained away as simple friendship. The detectives began to suspect that the missing woman's fate was tied directly to her involvement with the younger couple. It wasn't long before surveillance footage surfaced, showing Emily's car near the location where Linda had last been seen alive. That discovery shifted the focus of the entire case. Emily became the central figure in the growing theory that Linda had not disappeared on her own but had been silenced by someone close to her. Meanwhile, Thomas struggled under the weight of grief and betrayal. He sat in his empty house, fielding constant questions from police, neighbors, and friends. The truth of his wife's secret life became impossible to ignore. The whispers grew louder, and soon the entire community knew about the unusual arrangement between the couples. Some saw Thomas as a victim, others judged him for allowing his marriage to unravel in such a dangerous way. He felt both abandoned and exposed, a man whose private shame had become public spectacle. Jake, on the other hand, was unraveling quickly. His drinking grew worse, and his guilt made him reckless. The detectives noticed his nervous behavior during questioning, the way he fidgeted, avoided eye contact, and stumbled over his answers. Pressure mounted, and eventually he cracked. In a moment of desperation, he confessed to helping Emily cover up Linda's death. He insisted that he hadn't been involved in the act itself, claiming that Emily had acted alone, but his role in hiding the body was enough to seal his fate. His confession gave detectives the final push they needed to confront Emily with undeniable evidence. When Emily was brought back for questioning, the detectives laid everything out: the phone records, the surveillance footage, and Jake's confession. She didn't react with panic or tears. Instead, she spoke in a steady voice, admitting what she had done as though she had been waiting for the moment to come. In her mind, the act had been justified. She explained that Linda was stealing her husband, that the older woman had taken everything from her, and that she had no choice but to act. There was no apology, no sign of regret. Her calmness chilled everyone in the room. The case moved quickly through the courts once the confessions were secured. The media seized on the story, dubbing it a twisted tale of love, betrayal, and obsession. Reporters painted vivid pictures of the respectable older couple, whose quiet life had been destroyed, and the impulsive young couple whose choices spiraled into violence. Headlines screamed of the partner swap murder, and the story became a cautionary tale of how hidden desires can spiral into deadly consequences. During the trial, the courtroom was packed with curious spectators. Thomas sat in silence through every session, his face pale and expressionless as he listened to the details of his wife's final moments. He heard about the secret meetings, the jealousy that drove Emily, and the brutal way Linda's life had ended. Each word was another knife twisting into the hollow space that grief had carved inside him. Jake testified against Emily, describing in detail how she had killed Linda and forced him to help dispose of the body. He painted himself as a man caught in a storm, terrified and powerless, though the prosecution made it clear that his role was far from innocent. Emily sat coldly beside her defense attorney, never breaking down, never showing remorse. Her silence and lack of emotion became one of the most haunting aspects of the trial. The jury took little time to reach their decision. Emily was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Jake received a reduced sentence for cooperating, but even with his testimony, the judge showed little mercy. He was given years behind bars, enough to strip away the life he had once imagined for himself. For Thomas, the trial brought no closure. He had lost his wife in the most brutal way possible, and the truth of her betrayal hung over him like a permanent shadow. He returned to his home, now emptier than ever, with no one to fill the silence. The memories of Linda, once comforting, now came with the sting of her infidelity. He was left to wonder whether he had truly known her at all, or whether their marriage had been unraveling long before Jake and Emily ever entered their lives. The story lingered in the community long after the sentencing. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones about the warning signs they thought they had seen. Some swore they had noticed the strange closeness between the couples. Others admitted they had dismissed it as harmless fun. The tragedy became a reminder of how quickly ordinary lives can turn into something sinister when jealousy and obsession are given space to grow. In prison, Emily remained unshaken. She never expressed regret, never apologized to Thomas, and never admitted that what she had done was wrong. She saw herself as a woman who had been cornered, who had acted out of necessity. Her lack of remorse haunted those who had followed the case, leaving questions about whether she had ever truly loved Jake or whether her actions were simply driven by rage. Jake, serving his sentence, spoke often of his regrets. He admitted to anyone who would listen that he had been foolish, that he had let temptation destroy his life. But his words did little to change the reality. His youth was slipping away behind bars and his freedom was gone. He would spend years haunted by the role he had played in Linda's death, never able to escape the shadow of that night. The aftermath left scars that would never heal. Thomas lived with grief, Jake with guilt, Emily with cold defiance, and Linda's absence was a wound that could never be filled. The story of the two couples became etched into local memory, a chilling reminder of how quickly the pursuit of passion and excitement can unravel into tragedy. What began as a reckless game ended in betrayal, death, and lives destroyed. It was a story without winners, only shattered people bound together by one terrible choice. And as the years passed, the memory of Linda's death lingered like a warning, a dark echo of a night when desire turned into violence, and the line between love and hate vanished forever.